Hello? Good. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last panel of today's program. Before we get to the topic of the panel, I have two technical announcements. The first one is, let me see, where is it? That we were provided some copies of a journal. I cannot find the name now quickly. I had it somewhere. Of a journal called Contentious, the multidisciplinary journal of social protest. I don't know the journal, but I think it's a great opportunity to find out. So if you're interested, there are some copies of the journal at the registration desk. The second announcement is that, if you don't mind, we would like to take a picture of the participants of the conference. So after this panel, before we go to the dinner, we would do some group photo on stairs, or I don't know where, Lorenzo knows where, but please don't disappear, that we have, a lot of people on the picture from the conference. So we can start with the panel. I have bad news, as you already can see. Unfortunately, Eva Anduiza wasn't able to make it to the panel. There was some technical problems with the plane. I mean, she's okay, but she could not, don't worry. But she could not board the plane and she could not come to join us tonight, which is very unfortunate because she was actually the only one from the panelists who was going to use the word populism a lot during her speech. The rest of our panelists, because it's a panel on populism, but we can now switch it to populism ? Because we are gonna see what we are actually talking about. So let me introduce our panelists. I will start with the first speaker, who will be Bela Grešković, on the very right. He is a professor at the Department of International Relations and Department of Political Science at Central European University. He has done rich research focused on the political economy of East Central European capitalism, comparative economic development, social movements, and democratization. And his talk will focus on Hungary, a very important populist ? Authoritarian case, particularly discussing the development of right-wing civil society. Our second speaker is Colin Kraut, who is a professor emeritus of University of Warwick and external scientific member of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies at Cologne. He has published widely within the fields of comparative European sociology, industrial relations, economic sociology, and contemporary issues in British and European politics. He's going to talk about why nationalism became such a salient category for today's political identities. And we'll give us some advice on what counter movements can do to oppose it. So we will hopefully end with some positive message at the end. So the plan is that both speakers have 30 minutes. Then we turn to the audience, so you will have chance to intervene, ask questions. Please keep the discussion focused on the speakers, so don't give your own lecture. When we have the question time, try to end your intervention with a question mark at the end, okay? So, yeah, let's start, please.
So, thank you, Katka, very much, and all the organizers that we invited me to this very, very interesting and important event. And as you see, the title doesn't have the word populism. I will have probably one question about populism in the concluding part. What this will be about is actually a presentation of my ongoing empirical research on Hungarian right-wing civil society, which I will argue in the presentation is a very important factor in the resilience of Viktor Orbán's illiberal state building and competitive authoritarian political project in Hungary. Let me give you the structure of the presentation. I will start with the contextualization of my research and of the presentation, which is the worldwide, what I call the worldwide double attack on liberalism. Then I will analyze in most of the lecture the rebuilding the Hungarian right through a major movement, the Civic Circles movement between 2002 and 2010, before the right actually came to political power in Hungary. I will give you some details about my ongoing research, and then the questions, and I formulate some questions and puzzles, contributing a little bit to with my ideas on where the social movement research is or should be going, and what kind of puzzles we are faced with. So let me start. So the new political economic context, it is not very original what I am telling here, is that in a number of countries, in Europe and elsewhere in the world, liberalism is attacked, both as a political project and as an economic project. So liberalism somehow, as it were, cannot do much good today, whether it is perceived as an emancipatory political project that emancipates the wrong minorities, women against men, ethnic minorities, sexual minorities. It's wrong because this negatively affects the statuses of those who feel left behind. Liberalism at the same time, and often by the same political actors, is also attacked as neoliberalism because it promotes the rise of global inequality, insecurity, by promoting global capitalism. So then this whole double attack is either explained as a cultural backlash or driven by economic insecurity, social deprivation. What I find common to both of these logics is that it focuses on the grievances of the losers or the have-nots, and their electoral protest coalitions that are then brought together by populist leaders. The focus on the grievances of losers and have-nots, I sort of ironically attribute to what can be called the big liberal soul searching. Oh, we left behind the white working class. We stopped talking to the people. And I think this is not entirely wrong, and these explanations are not entirely wrong, but I find them incomplete, and here I see the importance of the Hungarian case. So first of all, what is specific in the Hungarian case is that the Hungarian illiberal attack, which combines the political and economic attacks on liberalism and neoliberalism, is extremely popular. It's extremely resilient. We are talking about a regime and a political force that has won 7 elections in a row, 3 national elections, all landslide, 2/3, and then several municipal and European elections. So it obviously has a strong popular support. And what my lecture focuses on, that this has to do with the strong base of this political force in civil society. And in this sense then, when you look at how the civil society was restructured in Hungary, and we talk about tectonic shifts before the change of the political fortunes, you see actually the agency of not the have-nots and the losers, but of the educated upper middle classes in the conquest of civil society, which had to forge illiberal identity communities. So actually, liberal soul searching here and there, we should also not forget about the agency of the right. The agency, the right has not won its spectacular political performance on the lottery. Not in Hungary, and I would say not in other countries. Now, let me repeat the argument more clearly. So the rise of the illiberal right in Hungary is rooted in its superior embeddedness in civil society, which the right has achieved in opposition. And founded by Viktor Orbán, who is the returning premier of the Hungarian government, the Civic Circles movement mobilized all fractions of the right, and there are three major fractions in Hungary: the Christian national middle class, of the educated right, the populist national middle class, and certain groups of the far right, into one major encompassing umbrella movement. Moreover, this movement even attracted movements that are less expansive in Hungary than in Western Europe, for instance, but that could be called new social movements. Pro-peace movements, environmentalists, not gay movements, right? But pro-poor movements as well. And through this, basically, the right managed to catch up in terms of civil organization with the left and the liberals, which initially were better established in civil society. They had their own civil society links. It's an interesting question, what happened to those? This is a question which I will ask at the end. And then basically the argument, the other part of the argument is that after 8 years in opposition, the accumulated social capital in civil society turned into political capital, which led into the first landslide victory of Orbán Viktor's National Conservative Fidesz Party in 2010, and helped to consolidate the illiberal rule ever since. Now, let me tell some words about the empirical basis of my research of the Civic Circles movement. It is a database of about 5,000 events over 2002-2006. The database is based on archival material and other media information, but the core is an electronic newsletter, which basically consists of the events calendars and the communication and the description of events of the civic circles with each other. So basically, I built up a database from this research or from this newsletter. The 5,000 events that I recorded can be small ones, like a lecture about something, but also bigger ones, like youth camps related to churches. They could happen in the territory of current Hungary, but also in the Hungarian diaspora, especially in the neighboring countries. And I have a pretty rich material about who did what, why, under which purpose, right? So it's, if printed, this material is about 4,500 pages or more. So it's a rich material, and I am just in the middle of working. This is just, a first summary of what I found. If you are interested in some of the details, I have a single publication so far from this. It's a working paper published in 2017 August as a working paper of the Schumann Center here related to EUI. Okay, there are 4 features of the Civic Circles movement that I give you just to characterize what we have in mind. It was a militant movement in terms of hegemonic aspirations and also in terms of their collective practices. I will explain what this means. It was massive in its membership and activities. We talk about 120 to 130,000 or even more activists, which is quite a bit for a country like Hungary of less than 10 million population. It is actually larger than the number of the combined party membership of all parties in Hungary that time. It's half of the membership of trade unions, of all the trade unions. So it's quite massive. It is strongly internetworked. And we are talking about starts in 2002, right? Well before the Facebook, Twitter age. The newsletter in 2006 was already sent to 26,000 email addresses, which were partly individual, partly group email addresses. There were about 10 to 11,000 civic circles in the territory of current Hungary and in the neighboring countries, but also in the United States and Canada, where there are larger Hungarian diasporas. It was educated middle-class based in terms of social stratification, so the main activists you have to have in mind were conservative, Christian, teachers, doctors, nurses, small, medium-scale entrepreneurs, priests, students studying in religious gymnasiums, their parents, and the like. Right? Now, interestingly, the left liberal governments, the rulers of the time, hastened to blame the civic circles movement as a mobilized fascist mob. This was not the case in light of the materials that I am reading. Then it was dominantly metropolitan and urban, so about 2/3 of the events were organized either in Budapest and in the capital city of Hungary and its agglomeration, or in the larger or smaller towns of the countryside. The civic circles never really got to villages, right? And many of the events, so 2/3 of these events were urban or metropolitan in Hungary, and about 1/10 of the events was organized in the neighboring countries, in the ethnic minority populated areas of the neighboring countries. Now, let me turn to militancy. First, the practices. This graph comes from another research. Together, we do this research with Jason Wittenberg, a friend and colleague of mine from Berkeley. It's based on an event database, a different one. What we find is that over the period of 1995 and 2011, the right, basically, in terms of the number of events, protest events, outperformed the left and the liberals. And the difference began to grow in 2002, precisely the date when the civic circles were founded. Not by chance, civic circles were more and more frequently mentioned among the organizers. By the way, it is not just the event number that has the same kind of divergence. Number of participants and duration of the protests shows a similar picture. Now, many of these protest events were actually not violent. So I call them graphomaniac protests, right? So these were petitions, open letters, public statements, which tells you another detail of that these were educated people. They loved to write protest letters and petitions, and the petitioning, constant petitioning, had also a purpose for party politics, because this was the way through which the conservative, the right-wing parties actually gathered information about supporters, which then helped them later canvassing, going door to door, convincing people. Okay, so this was about. Then the other story, hegemonic aspirations. So this movement, as I see it, was Janus-faced, and I will explain why and how from birth. It had both a Tocquevillian and a Gramscian aspect to it. And what you see here is young Viktor Orbán, the current leader of Hungary, founder of the movement, who many people think is an autocratic leader, next to Gramsci and Tocqueville. Now, this is not mere blasphemy, putting these people together. Because when Orbán Viktor looked like he looks now in 1989, in the middle, right? He was a left liberal revolutionary against the communist regime. And 2 years before that, when he was 23 years old, he submitted his diploma thesis to one of the Hungarian universities, and the title was Building Civil Society in an Authoritarian Regime, the Case of Polish Solidarity. Now, I had the privilege to read the dissertation for my work. It's not bad, it's good stuff. And it's full of quotations from Gramsci, Habermas, Alan Turing, and Tocqueville, and many others. So sometimes I tell myself, without making too much of this piece of evidence, that Orbán knows his Gramsci well, and I would wish that some of the current left liberal leaders would know him that well. So what basically the movement used was a hybrid winning formula. On the one hand, the movement implemented the principles of a Tocquevillian civic logic. On the one hand, movement participants saw themselves organizing in an oppressive regime. They basically considered the left liberal rule and their liberal democracy as a threatening tyranny of the majority. They tried to defend themselves. They were afraid that their causes will not appear in public media, that the checks and balances will not work for them, and therefore they tried to build up small circles of freedom. This is how they saw it, right? Pretty much the way how the current left and liberal opposition sees life under an authoritarian rule. The perceptions were very similar. So what then they did, following a Tocquevillian logic, they reorganized the social networks, reinvented the symbols, the heroes, cultural icons, and media, very often from the grassroots of the right. But then, this was combined with the Gramscian hegemonic logic, which was superimposed in this civic organizational principle, and basically harnessed civic activism in the service of the right-wing party politics, ultimately for political ends. And this then can be very much seen in the way the movement was coordinated, and there were several phases of coordinations by and with the party. So Orbán Viktor, when he founded the movement after the lost elections in 2002, gave a lecture, a speech, public speech to thousands of people, where his major message was, and this is what I find really hegemonic, at least telling about hegemonic aspirations, the nation cannot be in opposition. Right? If somebody is in opposition, then it should be the left liberal rulers if they fail to represent the interests of the nation. So basically questioning, on the one hand, the authentic national identity of left liberal parties and rulers, on the other hand, inviting everybody who shared this principle that the nation cannot be in opposition for a fight to regain hegemony. Another related slogan that was very frequently used that day, and it was about uniting all fractions and parties of the right under this umbrella movement. There is one flag, there is one camp. Okay. Now, the philosophy of a hegemonic movement was also represented and made an impact on the everyday tools of social movement activism. Let me give you an example. Right 3-4 months after the movement was launched, the movement center, an umbrella organization, organized a competition for the thousands of civic circles to describe what they do in their everydays, whether it is protest or cultural programs or educational activities, write a study, submit it, and then there were prizes. And the winners were circulated among all the civic circles by internet. And the winner is a study called, the title is Recapturing Everyday Life and the Holidays, a manual for civic circles. This then was published also as a book and was circulated among the audiences. Now, this was only one of the manuals. There were many others. There were legal manuals about how to protest disagreeable, anti-Christian, anti-national media content, for instance. Step by step described what civic circle members have to do in order to be both legal and efficient in their fight, and many others. From whom had these people, or wanted these people recapture everyday life and the holidays? First of all, this material had a mobilizing aim. Let's take farewell from our laziness. Let's be active. Let's fight for our cause, right? So again, militant and very efficient. And then, of course, the communists. So as a consequence of the mindset and lies of the last 50 years, our real holidays, their meaning, and the dynamism and freshness of our daily life are lost. Let's reinvent, let's recapture. This is how we can enjoy our regained freedom. Pretty much, actually, partly consistent with the kind of freedom language and, civic language. Not so surprising if you think about this. This was still a period of liberal hegemony, right? Okay. Now, when you read the materials on the civic circles' communication with each other, but you find recurrent that people enjoyed taking part in the civic circles. You read these materials, you want to be one of them. You understand the temptation. They felt to be taken serious, listened to. They felt that the community protects them, that they felt that the cause is good. The cause was nation, Christianity, everyday, our understanding of Europe, our understanding of what citizenship is. Now, how were these attachments forged or built up? So basically, or these feelings. So basically, the movement was very good in strengthening and building up attachments to the arguably strongest and most encompassing imagined communities, the nation, Christianity, citizenry, and Europe. Let's not forget, Hungary was accepted to Europe in 2004. 2004, Hungary became full member, and this was an issue for the right, which was actually still pro-EU during the previous government, and it was also an issue for the civic circles. And this happened, and you can follow actually, through very frequent encounters with a variety of activists. That the major groups include patriots or nationalists, members of and activists of nationalist or patriotic organizations, professionals who explain people policy relevant issues related to EU accession or other things, politicians. The conservative right-wing party was the strongest opposition party in the parliament. It had many positions in parliamentary committees, commissions, also at the local level. Priests, I will talk about the church, and media pundits, right-wing media pundits. So let's start with the nation. Okay. Here I show you a couple of artistic objects related. to the movement. So the nationalism of the movement was rather sophisticated. I would call it versatile nationalism. It offered varieties of understanding the nation to varied audiences. I can mention 4. One is the simplest, everybody understands, local patriotism, right? And you can actually learn about the frequency and contents of these imaginations deducted from the events organized, right? So it is not a framework that, it's a framework that I basically learn when reading the events. So one is basically events related to local patriotism. They were very good in producing calendars and local calendars. Another was what I call sacral medievalism, which is related to, various cults and stories of Hungarian saints, kings, processions, summer camps for young people or old people learning old Hungarian martial arts and so on. Some people would call it probably pre-modern, but I call it postmodern in the sense that actually these people were playing the same things as their children were playing when they read Game of Thrones, watch Star Wars, buy the computer games or table games related to it. So nothing to look down at. It's very, very contemporary thing. Events related to the European Union, where the issue was European Union is our future, Hungary is our country. Hungary is the first, never second. So these people were pro-European in their own ways. And then the biggest chunk of events related to the Hungary, to the nation of the 15 million Hungarians, which includes the cultural nation of Hungarians living not just in current Hungary, but what is called Greater Hungary. And if I had more time, I could explain you the symbolics of this stuff, but maybe in the question and answer session. And next kind of nationalism was characteristic to actually to the small, medium-sized entrepreneurs supporting the movement. Now, the way to understand their thoughts about the economics and of the nation as an economic unit in a highly transnationalized Hungarian capitalist economy is a useful term which I take from one of Richard Swedberg's recent publications about folk economics. So these guys developed folk economic nationalist understandings of why they suffer and what is to be done about it, right? And an interesting thing is that if you look at the sectoral division of these small, medium-sized entrepreneurs, they are active in mostly in sectors which have something to do with the economic body of the nation. Land, authentic food, wine, and of course the related retail sector, tourism, cultural tourism organization related to the visits to the neighboring countries, Hungarian minorities. Basically, the whole thing manifested itself in a network of authentic food shops, authentic national media shops. So this is then the background, the economic background. Now, in some sense, this folk economic nationalism of the civic circles also became a prefigurative political economy of economic nationalism under the Orbán regime. Because not by chance the regime mainly supports the kind of sectors for Hungarian capitalist dominance, which already the civic circles entrepreneurs found for themselves. Okay. Another aspect, what is important here, is that the churches were omnipresent. The so-called historical churches supported the movement very much. So you see here some numbers, just examples from January to June 2003. All in all, 700 events. 31% of these events were related in some ways to churches. They were either organized in churches or church-based property, or had church-based or related participants, either the clergy or other church-bound lay educated persons, and had their themes related to the church. So it's a very strongly Christian conservative aspect that can be. You can ask questions if you are interested, what can be thought about why the church is mobilized so strongly on behalf of the movement. I think the argument should go beyond simple assumption of ideological affinity. There were other things there. And then the battles for the right on public sphere, basically establishing right-wing media from the bottom to the top. So we see here very simple, so to say, I would not use the word primitive, but really sort of sweet local media for villages with a population of 300 people, where the first print media was produced by Civic Circle members, and it was about, the famous people of the village or important events in the life of the village, to building up a right-wing challenge to what these people saw, not quite incorrectly, as the media dominated by partly the left liberal rulers and their pundits, meaning the public media, and partly by commercial capital, which they also intensely despised and rejected because of the unacceptable contents. So the media-related events were mostly media pundits, right-wing media pundits meeting their audiences. These activists were traveling nationwide, giving lectures and talk shows, but then also combating disagreeable left liberal media news, or defending what they saw the last bastions of right-wing media, and doing a lot of fundraising, subscription, advertisement, and so on and so forth. And here I am encouraged to speed up, and end, actually. Yes, because this is all what I need. 1 minute. Okay. So, as I told you, I am in the middle of this research. So this is just the iceberg. And I have many questions. And one of them is, so this happened actually under 8 years, consecutive years of left liberal parties in the government. So how come that the response to this was so weak as it was? So what were these guys doing? Remembering the good old times of 1968 or what? It's not quite clear. So is the pure response, and the fact that the left liberal civil society close to disappeared in Hungary due to pure negligence? Is it a post-communist specificity? One can argue it is. That it is very difficult to be left after 45 years of communism because of the stigma, and it is very difficult to import the liberal new social movements, left libertarian social movements from the West, with a very different history and a very different economic development level. So then what came in was foreign financed in terms of new social movements. So that can be partly a post-communist specifics, or what we see now more and more, that this is not just a Hungarian story. Of course, details might differ, but probably it's relevant for other countries. How far is this part of a general global and or European trend? And if we if all three aspects appear, then in what combination in various countries? So this could actually open the way for comparative research on how the right came to power. The next is the populism story. What I see and read in the rise of the right in Hungary, I find the populism label narrow. So I think it maybe describes certain kind of rhetorical solutions, but mostly after the right came to power. So yes, the Fidesz government in the last 12 years or 8 years used lots of populist rhetorics and methods, but then the lesson of my research is that if you want to be an efficient populist, it's not a bad thing to start with building an effective Gramscian civil society builder. So how far is populism now as a paradigm a help or a hindrance to understanding what's going on in Hungary? And then the last question, obviously, working on at a university, not particularly liked at the moment by the power holders in Hungary because of its commitment to principles of open society. It's also a policy-relevant question. So can the rainbow banner, by which I mean, the social movements and political directions and ideologies that are for openness, diversity in civil society, for debate and respecting otherness, learn from those who rally around the tricolor and the cross, namely the kind of movement organizer that I just described. And in more, obviously, I see the learning vice versa happened, actually. But then what about the lost positions of the rainbow banner? Open society, new social movements, and so on. How can they get back to more influence? And then the toughest question here is a new hegemonic strategy based on faith in and respect for the diversity possible at all? And what would be, to talk with Hochschild, the deep story people or friends of open society can tell? Apart from that, diversity is beautiful. Thank you very much.
Our talks may seem to be very different in the kind of content, but actually I think I hope you'll see at the end, they're actually very similar. What I say seems to have no relationship at all. Some years ago, back in 2003, I wrote a little book called Post-Democracy, which was about how, it could be something said by Orban, I suppose, about how elites were controlling politics and ordinary people really had little chance to make autonomous contributions to politics, and democracy was becoming a manipulated game. But I said that in the societies, certainly of Western Europe and the United States, one or two other places, there were still movements that emerged out of the people that could challenge and shake elites and perhaps change the political agenda. And I mentioned three of these: environmentalism, feminism, and xenophobia. And it's interesting to look at what's happened to these three over the years. They've all had their successes. The environmentalist movement partly, of course, became a set of movements that turned themselves into parties, in that we actually got green parties in many countries. The green parties were never that successful. They always remained rather small, though they sometimes entered government. But at the wider level of social movement, of influence on public opinion, of campaigns, especially campaigns against corporations, one can say that the environmentalist movement has continued to be a major phenomenon of our society and has made a major contribution. Obviously, environmentalists are very dissatisfied because the state of the planet continues to get worse, but at least they have been a major force as a social movement and continue to be. Feminism has been probably even more powerful. It comes and it goes, and one thinks, oh, feminism has died out, it's all finished, but then it comes back. In the last year, it's come back with enormous force. Feminism very rarely, unlike environmentalism, leads to political parties, because it's actually very difficult, given that men and women tend to live together. It's very difficult to organise party antagonism around gender. But at the level of pure social movements across a wide range of areas of society, touching a mass of different issues, I think one would say, yeah, feminism still manages to be a major force shaping society and challenging the perspectives of elites, to the extent that elites have started to try and take feminism over. Xenophobia has become, however, the most prominent of all three, and has had the most success in being both social movement and political parties, in that either new parties based around xenophobic issues or old parties who've turned themselves into xenophobic parties have become the most important phenomenon in our societies today. So so the career of these three movements has been, they've all had successes, but they've been rather diverse. And it's interesting in particular to see their different success in translating into parties. Environmentalism, yeah, parties, but not very successful ones. Feminism, enormously successful as a movement, but not parties. Xenophobia, both movements and parties. And one says, well, what is it that makes a movement move from being an important social phenomenon with lots of activism, lots of campaigns, political pressure, to being something that really touches the hearts and minds of very large numbers of people, which is something I would say that both feminism and xenophobia have done, but environmentalism, by and large, hasn't. And I think one has to start with the approach that ordinary people, one's thinking, so you can have a very successful social movement that doesn't really touch very large numbers. It's when you want to get into real democratic politics, you have to try and think enormous numbers, millions. But most ordinary people are too busy, issues are too complicated, they don't think much about political things. Historically, ordinary folk get involved in politics when there is some kind of struggle about inclusion or exclusion of a social identity, not a political one, a social identity that they do understand and do feel they have. And so this kind of politics takes the form, it says, you, like we, are members of identity X. Other people are identity Y, and they want to exclude you from citizenship or certain rights. Join us and we will fight to prevent them excluding us. Or, you are identity Y, we are identity Y. People out there with identity X want to come and take away our privileges or share them. Together, we can fight to stop them doing that. And that's the form that historically the shaping of democratic politics took. And there, X and Y, there are two sets of identities in there, those around social class and those around religion. And certainly if you look at Western Europe, the history of democratic politics is the shaping of parties and movements around conflicts over inclusion, exclusion, about class and religion. The United States, it's a more complicated story. The United States and Ireland, you get civil wars looming very large and shaping it all according to more complicated criteria. But in Western Europe, normally this is how we shaped our democracies. Eventually, the struggles around exclusion and inclusion are resolved through the concept of universal citizenship. So, okay, you're all included. Right? But the memory of the past struggles, the memory that some people are really different from you and that we wanted to exclude each other and we wanted to be included, those memories shaped our parties. Eventually they became memories of struggles, eventually memories of parents' and grandparents' struggles. So over time, these identities have become weak, obviously. They're rooted in the past. And or in particular, looking especially at Western Europe, again, the United States is a very different story, actually. Religion simply has declined as something important. Class, I would argue, remains extremely important to the division of society, but not the classes that fought the struggle over citizenship. Today, it's much more difficult for people to have a class identity because to have a class identity, you need other groups who are defining you as excluded, right? or you try and define others as excluded. Once you've got universal citizenship, you can't do that anymore. And so the classes of post-industrial society have great difficulty achieving political expression, overt political expression. They have a kind of secret political expression. So we come to societies by the end of the last century where political identities based in social identities were becoming weak. There is one new candidate. Well, it's not a new candidate, it's a very, very old candidate, which begins at the same time that weakening has happened. This other identity starts to acquire a new importance, although it was always there, and that's nation. If one takes the forces of globalization, of mass immigration, of cultural exchange, eventually large flows and streams of refugees, of antagonism between the Islamic world and parts of the Western world. All of these issues together, over the last 20 or so years, have made a national identity a more salient thing. It used to be salient quite a while ago, but in Western Europe in particular, the experience of fascism and Nazism taught politicians that this is an area you better not go. This is dangerous stuff. Memories of that have faded. And so with these forces, globalization, mass population movements, cultural mixing, nation started to acquire a new prominence. And it is a perfect identity for the purpose of struggles over inclusion and exclusion. Because we are the nation, we are the included. There are people challenging our national identity. They might be multicultural people, as in Hungary, or indeed as in Britain. Multicultural people who advocate a dilution of national identity. It might be foreigners themselves, whether it's immigrants, refugees, or international organizations, which in particular cause a lot of trouble for British and American nationalists. So nation has started to have this new or renewed importance, and it's quite a powerful one. And so and I think one can explain most of what's been happening in the last few years by that, the way in which nationalism has fallen into the vacuum that was left. And examples as to why I would evidence that I would claim for the hypothesis is you compare Denmark and Portugal. Denmark always comes out in surveys as the happiest place in the world. It's got a beautifully efficient modern economy. It has less social inequality than anywhere else and has the most wonderful welfare state. It also has a very successful xenophobic party. Portugal, second poorest country in Western Europe, enormous inequality, poor welfare state. There's no xenophobia at all. And you could add Sweden in with Denmark, and you put Spain with Portugal. It's interesting, the two countries in Western Europe where xenophobic movements have least traction are Spain and Portugal. Now, Spain and Portugal joined the democratic world in the 1970s. So if my theory is right, that great big conflicts around exclusion and inclusion over class and religion gradually wear out, theirs hasn't been wearing out so much. And you actually sense this if you talk to people in Portugal in particular, also Spain, that those struggles around identities are still quite sharp for them. Whereas in Denmark and Sweden, they've had politics around class for a long, long time, and people are forgetting what it was all about. Now, you might say, if I'm right about that, then surely in Central and Eastern Europe, where democracy is even more new, then shouldn't they be places where the old conflicts around identities of class and religion should be the most powerful? But no, because, and I think Bella made this point at some point, under communism, none of these identity conflicts had the same sort of way of expressing themselves. And we saw this in the first few years of democracy in Central Europe, that at first I think people expected, certainly the Germans expected, that social democracy and Christian democracy would come out as the main things that were happening, as they had really in Spain with democracy. And parties were organised a bit on that basis, but they all failed. And one got a period where there was a great, well, there still is actually, a fragmentation of parties. Very low participation in voting now often. Parties based around wealthy men gathering together a kind of charismatic support and financial support. Very unstable parties. It's as though people in that part of the world didn't have social identities that made political sense to them until, starting with Orban and then spreading to Poland and now the Czechia and Slovakia, politicians discovered the nation. Yeah, there's something we can, you see, it's no good discovering the nation as an identity if it's got no enemies. Because, well, okay, we're all this, yeah? Now, we don't disagree about this, now let's find some conflict. No, you can define, no, we are the nation, and there's other people who therefore aren't the nation. In other words, and this is where we get close to the problems of populism, if you look at the works of Jan Werner Müller, the Austrian political scientist who's written very interestingly about populism. He says part of populism is denying the right to be a people to anyone who doesn't support you. You're not real people. And we've got this in Britain at the moment. If you oppose leaving the European Union, you are a traitor. You shouldn't have any rights. You should shut up. You should no longer speak. Because if it says we are the nation, we are the people, the nation can never be in opposition, and therefore we are really the only thing. And this is extremely powerful, and it emerges out of a people. It clearly has deep social resonance, but the big problem with it is, can it sustain democracy? And so one starts to revisit, what are the other candidates? What are the other identities around that can generate movements? Not necessarily parties. It doesn't need. More important is about social movements that are deeply rooted, not just in small numbers of activists, but in masses, millions of people. And going back to the ones I was talking about, class, in a way, is a potential candidate always, especially since the last 10 years, since the financial crisis, have shown us that class issues of a very basic, old-fashioned kind are very, very raw and real. But organising these into, you can quite easily organise movements like Occupy Now and We Are the 99%. Social movements can be based on this, but can that get into deep social identities that people have? That's problematic because it's too intellectual in a way. Doesn't speak to people's emotions. The environmental movement, same thing, the same problem. It doesn't speak to a deep social identity. Feminism, I still think, has a place in the struggles around xenophobia. It might seem as though, in a way, these are just talking about totally different things, right? One movement's about the nation and opposing immigrants. The other's about women. What on earth have these got to do with each other? But I think there is a link, actually, in that there is an important edge, I only call it an edge, a kind of margin of xenophobic and nationalistic movements, is a kind of violence. Violence is a very masculine, and there are violent women, okay, but by and large, a rejoicing in violence is a rather masculine characteristic. And I do think that rejection of the kind of mix of nationalism and the enjoyment of masculinity, which both Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump profess, which is what I think brings those two together, although other ways they don't see much in common. There is underneath the new xenophobic populism, there is a kind of a machismo, which means men and women alike who don't like it will often find feminist movements speaking for them. Feminism could never actually be a full counter to xenophobic populism, partly because it's about gender. It's about a different issue, and because it finds it very difficult to move beyond movements to form parties. But I do think it provides, the voices of women do provide at the moment probably the most important counter to the new xenophobic movements, as deeply rooted social movements. But then finally, there is the question of whether the kind of people that Mr. Orban wants us to dislike, the kind of people that some of us in this room would like to think we are, people who actually believe in multicultural values and who think that it's time we did not take so much notice of the nation, we got beyond that. Does that create a social identity that's strong enough actually to carry political weight? This is the very, it probably actually united with wing aspects of feminism. Because it's interesting that the sort of what one might call left liberal, as Bella's called it, opinion, it might look highly intellectualized, but it does have certain social roots. There are people in society who actually respond to that. Question is how big they are in numbers and what kinds of movement that generates. But evidence that it is, that one's getting at something below just a set of intellectual opinions to something more profound, I found in just one tiny piece of research evidence, but it fascinates me. And that is someone, I don't know how they did it actually, but they did research on the supporters and opponents of Brexit in Britain and the opponents and supporters of Donald Trump in America. They asked them lots of questions about their attitudes. And there's one question they asked, which it's a very subtle question. It may even be difficult to translate into other languages. That is, what is more important? That a child be respectful and have good manners, or that a child is thoughtful about others? Now, these are not opposites, right? You don't have to choose between those, but they may even overlap. But the question is, which is more important of those two? And people who voted for Trump and for Brexit said it's more important they have good manners. People who voted against Trump and against Brexit said it's more important that they're kind to others. Now, but there's something strange there, right? It does make a sense, and probably a lot of us think, yeah, I understand that. But it's not just at a kind of intellectual level. That it's responding to something deeper in us about how we see society and how we see the world. Now, at the moment, there is a great challenge being issued, really, by people like Viktor Orban and Donald Trump and the supporters of Brexit and the Polish government and the the people who are just trying to form a government in this country, and the people who are now in government in Austria, and the people who are supporting governments in Denmark and Norway. It's a widespread phenomenon. They're challenging us, and they're saying, or they're challenging people, saying, rally around the nation. That's the identity that will move you. And there are enemies to that identity, and they're your enemies. Finding a counter to that, that's not just a kind of set of intellectual movements, but something that is deep inside people's feeling, so they're willing to do things, active things to support. That's going to be one of the biggest questions in the next few years.
Thank you very much to both of our speakers. And now we can open the floor for your questions.
Thank you for two very, very interesting talks. There is many more questions than I should allow myself to pose here. So I'll try to keep it brief. One question, or I guess a double-barreled question for Bella. One slide you showed us shows that there's a higher level of protest among right-wing people, well, that there's more right-wing protest in Hungary than left-wing protest. And this is quite extraordinary, because I guess the research, which is based, I think, mainly on Engelhardt's work, shows that right-wing people typically identify more with authoritarianism and are therefore less likely to engage in protest. So on the basis of that, I was just wondering, how should we interpret this? Should the difference between left and right be seen as even bigger than this, given the hesitation of right-wing people to engage in protest? If they hadn't had that hesitation, would the difference be even bigger? I guess it brings me to the point about whether the question is that the right, as you suggest, is better at mobilizing than the left, or that it simply is a representation of greater right-wing sentiment in the population. Obviously, those two are not unrelated. There is something called consensus mobilization, and mobilization and opinion are obviously not unrelated. But that is one, I guess, set of questions that I had for you. And for Colin, I had the question or suggestion that the answer you are posing is maybe already in the way you phrase it. You say, where can we find a counter to that right-wing mobilization? Well, maybe it is in that counter that we find it. Maybe the counter-movement against this counter-movement, this right-wing counter-movement, is perhaps what can bind it, and that does speak to people's emotions, because right-wing populism, the emergence of that, does speak to people's emotions, does speak to people's fear of fascism, Nazism, and that might bring people together. I think there is some movements, there is some evidence of groups that are trying to find that those partnerships in opposition to that. I was recently speaking to a German climate activist. The interview was about why are they not investing in building a global climate movement. So it was completely a different topic. But the explanation he gave is he gave a German expression. The German expression is that a social movement has a Standbein and a Spielbein. The Spielbein, the playing leg, is used for their main activity, and that is at the moment anti-coal activism in Germany. The Spielbein is the playing leg, or the Standbein. Well, I'm confusing it now. The second leg you can use for something optional. And he said at the moment that is not to build a global movement, however important that might be. At the moment it is to find solidarity with immigrant rights movements, with women's rights movements. And so I think that in this question of what can be the counter, there is the answer, namely the counter movement is the counter movement, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Please answer right away. Yeah.
Joost, excellent question. So one of the issues that I immediately would like to tell is that if you want to understand the so first of all, I think this frame or this figure would be consistent with actually what Engelhardt thinks. Because what he would think is that, A, the silent revolution has not really happened in Hungary or in East European countries to the extent that it happened to the West, for the simple reason that these are pretty poor countries. So basically materialist considerations still play a lot of role among the values, and that also would explain the weakness, the related weakness of new social movements, right? So one kind of organizational aspect of the left liberal protest is already out, right? Then we have the trade unions, the classic left. Now, you know, trade unions, it's a subject of an earlier research I was conducting. It's trade unions organize much less strike activity and other kinds of activities in East Central Europe after the change than in the West or in the South. Of course, there are differences, country-specific differences, but that's the overall picture. Why? These people were crushed by economic transformation, transnationalization crisis, ongoing. They lost much of their membership. In terms of their civil society basis, you know, the kind of civil society or civic activism, social activism workers had under the old regime was to a large extent concentrated to their employment in big firms. They went for holidays, you know, met their families in the holiday houses of the big socialist firm. They went to cultural events in the cultural centers financed by the big socialist firms. They, in many ways, they were proud of being there, you know, working for a prestigious Hungarian machine building factory meant for generations, partly because these were already active in the interwar period. Now, all these guys lost these kind of things. The right-wing milieu, you know, with the church-bound activities, the patriotic organizations, and so on, was not open for them because they were prolets, looked down, you know, by the middle-class guys. So where did they go? To the pub, right? And then there is anthropological research which tells you that, you know, you could be proud of being a worker in the big Raba factory, which was one of the, you know, champions of Hungarian vehicle industry, but you don't feel the same thing being employed by a subsidiary of Audi. It's not yours. So, you know, maybe I am romanticizing a little bit, but not entirely. So, you know, it's probably, it would be wrong to look down on. So this kind of, so your answer, and the other hand, yes, I think the right was better in mobilizing. The frames of the nation, of Christianity, Europe, and citizenship were new under socialism. So people were not reborn or born nationalists or you know, believers and so on. They had to be re-educated through community activities. They could have been educated otherwise, you know, had the left and liberals paid some attention. They were busy with other things. So yes, and then these ideas were also fresh after communism, and you know, therefore this return to the 30s. That was the pattern, but these were not outdated things. And one more thing, what is very interesting, sorry for just 2 sentences. Another interesting slogan used by the movement was equal right to remember. And that is equal right for remembering grievances. And the context is the following. These people, right-wingers, felt that the left and liberals already got their sort of memory field in terms of remembering the Holocaust, right? Left, liberal, Jew was often, hand in hand, plus the bank still. And what they told, yes, but now it's our turn. We suffered as well. We suffered after 45 from communist rule, after the 56th revolution, because of the 200,000 refugees of Hungary. We suffered population losses due to the communist deportations of basically the whole middle class. It's now turned for equal remembering. So this was also the content behind the fresh content behind rethinking the holidays along these lines. So, fresher framing, new ideas, old ideas in new dress, weakness of new social movement in the East, a la Engelhardt, crushing of the old left, whatever it was still there, by extreme radical transnationalization and neoliberal economic policy.
These are fascinating questions. I think there is a specificity of Central and Eastern Europe here in that for a long while the dominant and very intolerant regime defined itself as the left. So in a way, left and right, they don't even stand on their heads, actually. They just don't have any standpoint. And in that part of the world, it's very difficult to know what is left and what is right. So it's a special case. But even then, even forgetting that, you said surely that people on the right are authoritarian and they don't protest. It depends. Who is your idea of the figure of the far right? Is it Louis XIV or Adolf Hitler? Because these are two very different people. The right has concept of the extreme right has two very different meanings. One is total authoritarianism, totally traditional, that requires everyone to keep in their place. The other one is one that says, yeah, we do that, but only after we've made hell. And so I think one can get authoritarians who feel really oppressed will say, yeah, we've got a right now to do this. But you went on to talk about something very interesting, which is really your German colleague, and seeing the environmentalism linked up with immigration and the issues. There's a kind of gestalt there, to use another German word, a kind of shape that people seem to belong to. So if you've got one set of attitudes, you probably have the other set of attitudes. And this is interesting. It's interesting anyway, but it's particularly interesting when we say, where do neoliberals fit? Clearly in Hungary, they're liberals, right? But sometimes they're seen as being part of the rightist phenomenon. And if you look around at xenophobic movements in Europe, East and West, sometimes you find they very much share a kind of social agenda. So Marine Le Pen and the Front National in France, or the Danish far-right movement, are very pro-welfare, provided it's for pure nationals. There are others like Norway, where they're neoliberal xenophobes. Or you get cases like Britain and the United States, where they're totally confused. So Donald Trump, on the one hand, wants to stop globalization, but on the other hand, wants to stop all regulation of financial transactions. So where the xenophobic movements relate to neoliberalism is complex, and where are neoliberals part of the liberal family, right? But just one little tiny story, which illustrates, I think, some of the nuance that are here. We had that referendum in Britain 2 years ago on belonging to the European Union. And the two leaders of the government of the time, David Cameron and George Osborne, were completely smashed by this. And in particular, George Osborne, who was the finance minister. And he's the most perfectly political person there is, in that he doesn't do anything that's not political. And he was very, very distressed at the referendum result. He's very pro-European, and he's also an extreme neoliberal. Right? He just disappeared. Reporters were trying to get hold of him. What do you think of the referendum, Mr. Osborne? And he said nothing. And then on a Sunday after the referendum, he sent out one tweet. He congratulated a colleague of his in the government because she'd had the courage to come out as a lesbian. Now, this is a totally political man, right? If he was signaling something there. He was saying, we liberals have got to stand together. You've got to include us neoliberals with you now. That's what he was trying to say. And it does raise interesting questions. And if there's a kind of xenophobes, old-fashioned social democrats and neoliberals, that triangle makes interesting families.
I really enjoyed the discussion of what was going on in Hungary, the building of this movement infrastructure that underpinned the political victory of Orban. So 2 questions about that is, first of all, where did the money come from? Where did the resources come to build this infrastructure? And secondly, was it simply Orban's genius that came from his studies of the solidarity movement, or is I didn't know what extent you were saying that it was him as a particular strategic kind of thinker that created this infrastructure?
Happily. Thank you very much. So I'm not yet entirely able to answer the money questions. What I can see empirically from the material I have is that there were frequent requests for donations, and people did donate. Now, obviously, I was not there whether, to observe the money flows, but it looks like, yes, there was a positive response to this. The diaspora, very clearly, US, Canadian, Argentinian diaspora very clearly helped. The kind of folk economic nationalist guys, the small and medium-sized entrepreneurs who were offered opportunities to sell their food, their wine, and so on and so forth, were clearly ready to support the movement. There were already some bigger national capitalist firms, for instance, a Hungarian retail chain that donated, and I read evidence of the movement thanking for it. And then, this last thing, there could be all kinds of practices which I better don't want to know about, right? I don't want to know too much about this movement. But one aspect is clear, that before spending 8 years in opposition, the Fidesz government was already 4 years in power. And I guess they saved some sources, for these situations. Everybody asked the issue of money, but I would say that if there is a project, there is money. You always can find domestically or externally some founder for that. So, but this is my answer. Otherwise, I am working on this should be a book at one point, and this could be a political economy chapter where I also have an idea about how they perceived welfare-related activism, right? In one word, most of the welfare-related donations went to the other countries, the minorities. So they were about maintaining the cultural, educational, and health level of Hungarian minorities abroad. Who was around was left to the government, right? So that's the other thing is it's not a one-man show. So I am able, but it's big work to put together basically a list of the major ideologues of the movement. So Orban was supported by, first of all, large organizations, both church-bound and patriotic, and intellectual organizations. So, for instance, there is a still functional the professor circle, conservative professor circle. So there were many people who came up with ideas and implementing this. So this whole story, I don't want to, derive the whole movement from Orbán once upon a time, reading Gramsci and Habermas and Alan Turing, but it's interesting, sort of a coincidence. He is certainly not unprepared for organizing a civil, right-wing civil society. So I would say interaction, the pattern of coordination, how far the personal agency mattered, how far the party then that integrated later some parts of the movement mattered, and what were the conflicts within the movement, which drove various branches of the movement to different directions, is another story which I could not touch upon here.
So we have one question here, then we do Mario, and then we move. Let's move here. Don't worry, we have 30 minutes, so I hope we manage everyone. Then I suggest we move here. I saw like 3 hands there, or 4, and then we can come back there. So please take your time.
Thank you both for your presentations, very thought-provoking. Both of you in different ways, I think, at least nod to, and you were explicitly mentioning a few minutes ago, something that I found myself thinking as I listened to both of you, which is that one of the things that happens in sort of 1989 to 91, of course, right, is liberalism supposedly triumphs, and liberalism is going to solve all sorts of things. And pretty quickly it doesn't, and pretty quickly neoliberalism takes hold, right? And politics almost is treated as an afterthought or somehow beside. What matters is the economy, and so in a lot of places we see austerity, and in others, other versions. Anyway, I'm wondering if both of you could speak a little more to what role you think a kind of failure or collapse of liberalism plays in emboldening these sorts of movements.
Partly because it does depend on whether one's talking about liberalism more generally or neoliberalism, and they are different. Neoliberalism's, well, you see, first you get the early 1990s, you get the collapse of the Soviet system and what looks like an enthusiastic embrace of liberal democracy and of capitalism in Central and Eastern Europe. At the same time, you get a kind of liberation of democracy in Latin America taking place, partly because the United States isn't frightened of communists over there anymore, so it lets them have free elections. So you get this extraordinary boom of democracy. At the same time, it's that same period, you've got very major steps in the neoliberal agenda. So the neoliberalism had got going very strongly in the United States and the United Kingdom in the 1980s, but it doesn't really get deeply embedded in continental Europe until the 90s. And then you also get the British and the Americans deregulate finance. And so you really get what looks like a kind of high tide of liberal democracy and a high tide of neoliberalism. That crashes in 2008. Many people expected that would lead to a major political shift against neoliberalism. I actually wrote a little book at that time called The Strange Non-Death of Neoliberalism. So I could see why it wouldn't happen. But actually what happened was a kind of delayed reaction, but a reaction that which joined with other things to be part of the new xenophobic movements. Now one looks back, most mainstream social democratic parties had become part of neoliberalism, and one includes the American Democrats in that. If you look at Schroeder and Blair and Clinton, these people all shared a lot of the neoliberal agenda. It was left to social movements rather than parties to challenge what had been going on, and they found it very difficult to get any political traction because it was mainly a kind of intellectual critique. It's only when the nationalists start to join a critique of some aspects of neoliberalism and of liberal democracy with their own campaign that you got traction for new movements. And I think it happens like that, really. And but on the face of it, one might get a right-wing populism that can use liberal democracy. But it tends to be very critical of liberal democracy, actually, partly because of this business, we are the people, you therefore are not the people. And we've got this, it's interesting, in Hungary and in Poland, you have governments saying, we can't accept that law courts challenge us. Who are these law courts? And you've got exactly the same in the United Kingdom, exactly the same rhetoric. So this is not something that's, and of course Donald Trump uses a similar thing. So the critique of liberal democracy is not just about democracy itself, but those other institutions that under a liberal system, and neoliberal or liberal, actually say there are limits to the power of the state. Or the limits to the power of government. And there are law courts, there are autonomous central banks, there are parliaments. And that these things check government. That's the liberal model. But the populist model says, no, we are the people. What right has Parliament got to stand in the way of the people? What right have law courts got? So for that reason, the xenophobic movements find it very difficult to cohabit with many of the institutions of liberal democracy. So I think this is how we've got into that crisis. It's partly that it can all be wrapped together as a crisis of globalization, with globalization being interpreted to mean both neoliberal political economy and immigrants and foreigners. That's how it all fits.
Yeah. So
pick up.
So I just thought that I agree very much with all what Colin said, but I add two small points. One is that, and here I rely on Peter Mayer. So I think that the kind of social activism, ersatz social ersatz activism thrives when democracy is representativity, responsiveness weakens. So in hollow democracies, you are likelier to get the kind of responses. And, these are the times for activists. And just one, that I read this nice paper by Donatello Della Porta about the European Social Forum, and that is introduced by a quotation from a left liberal activist, obviously a 68ers, how he survived the terrible 80s and the 90s and the yuppie this and that. And I found something very, very similar in one of the Civic circle right-wing activists' comments on how he is afraid from the time what is now coming. That so there is some activist soul behind being on the left, on the right, but this is only a guess. And this is and neoliberalism does have an impact of hollowing, as responsibilities of government and so on. So in a way, obviously, I mean, the civic circle movements and what they did is not my cup of tea, but it's the cup of tea of my mother. So if I want to talk with my mother, and I would like to talk with her or maintain with that half of the country, I better try to understand what they had on mind and what was their problem. And many of their problems are justified,
Yep. Just to connect exactly on that, and what Joost was saying about the puzzle of protest being more widespread among right-wingers. Yeah, that is a puzzle. Itself remains a puzzle, but at the same time, I think we've been driven too much, really, by the narrative that there is a continuity between civic engagement, which correlates with protest engagement, and there was a full logic to argue that, to suggest the protesters were not aliens or dispossessed, deprived, mentally affected people, disabled people. But at the same time, I think we have probably overlook the fact that correlation, even when our correlations are strong, there is a lot of variance which is not explained, and there is not an automatic continuity between the two, and there is an immense amount of social civic active participation, which does, and by far the most massive civic participation doesn't take in forms which are strictly leading into the political, is purely voluntary association, community groups, organizing local festivities, celebrations, etc. And this guy, that's where I think, not only in Hungary, I think Hungary is perfectly comparable in that to the West. That's where the current so-called populist, which I accept is a kind of tricky word, come from. Other things, the intellectual of the right, there have always been conservative middle classes intellectuals, even in Italy. The problem was that the narrative at the time was such that they were the pariahs. And in a way, I think it's delusional to think that, I mean, I don't mean you implied that, but I think it would be delusional to think, well, now there are these bloody awful populists who say, either we stigmatize everybody who doesn't think in the same way as they do, as none of the people. Yeah, I mean, I can tell you, I lived the 70s in Italy, and if you were operating in the university intellectual sector, and you were not a sort of progressive left-winger, you were exactly that way. Simply, I didn't notice for sure. I suspect many didn't notice because it resonated with the time. And I understand totally the frustration of these guys, and they're coming back. For a third point, the other point, the deprivation is not just the white middle class from Flint, Michigan, which is being idealized in the accounts about Trump's success, but it's also, in general speaking, the middle class is somehow affected. And in many ways, so that creates there is a deep element of material needs. And I don't think new social movement activists in many ways are not exactly the best people to speak to counter that narrative, simply not because we are wealthy, and I apologize to the youngsters in the audience who are not guaranteed at all, but in the perception, we are still, the new middle class, new social movement people are still largely associated with the public sector and the social sector, which is increasingly wrongly perceived as safer, less exposed to market competition than the other ones. But again, that puts us in a difficult position. And I think you're optimistic, Colin, about feminism being a counter response to it's certainly a strong intellectual response to the machism of Trump, but I'm not sure it can provide for this reason the kind of response. Can I indulge just once more? We just come out from Trento, and in Trento we had the annual meeting of the Alpine troopers. And there was a big fuss. I'm dealing with that because anarchists, including from my department, they put out placards calling the Alpine troopers assassins, etc. Well, there is a big fuss going on. And on the other hand, the counter-narrative was that there were hundreds of thousands of people and a lot of sexually, it wasn't as bad as like in Cologne, but there were a bit of sexual, a lot of sexual innuendos, and I mean, Alpine troopers are matches. Now, what the problem, why now everybody is spitting at the anarchists, rightly so I have to say, and nobody is blaming the Alpine troopers, because Alpine troopers, 90% of what they do is basically a voluntary association. There is an earthquake in Italy, there is a bad flooding. The Alpine troopers, retired Alpine troopers come, not the military in the 70s, the old ones come and help. You need to organize something in the local community to provide something material. They come and help. The anarchists usually are less effective in doing that. And that's it. So if you don't capture the level of the material needs, I think we remain lost.
I didn't sense a question mark at the end, so if you want to, so we can go on.
Very nice comments. Yeah.
So we have a question, I hope question in the back.
Yes, I will try to keep it short. Colin has already mentioned an alliance between neoliberalism and liberal democracy, but isn't that a bit too easy for us to understand ourselves as being social liberal? There's been the argument by Nancy Fraser that at least parts of the new social movements have built an alliance with parts of the neoliberal sector. And that explains why people voted against the Democrats. And I think she mentions Hillary Clinton as the perfect personification of that alliance. So what do you think about this argument that the children of 1968 and the children of maybe Milton Friedman have they get along quite well, actually?
Well, until about 3 years ago, sort of liberal social democrats regarded neoliberals as the worst enemy. Things have become a bit more complicated just very recently, and behind this, I see something very fundamental going on. In that, ever since the French Revolution, which is really when things start, right? Ever since the French Revolution, there have been two axes in politics which can be seen as left versus right. The very first one was traditional Catholic conservatism versus liberal, secular reformists who, as time passed, also capitalists against feudalism. And that was the original right-left axis. Gradually, during the 19th century, there's a different one grows up, and that's around winners and losers in capitalist society itself. That's about equality and inequality. So gradually, that second axis becomes more important than the first one. First one never goes away. It goes on, certainly in this country, it went on for a long time, struggles, eventually become struggles about sexual behavior and sexuality, about abortion, contraception, divorce. And these issues carried on of tradition versus liberalism, but more and more important became the politics of the welfare state, the politics of inequality. And eventually that seemed to be the only thing that politics was about. Because true conservatism was in complete retreat, right? Because true conservatism is hostile to science, it's hostile to knowledge. Conservatives ran away from all that. So there's a kind of victory of liberalism over traditional conservatism. The battle over inequality goes on and becomes more fierce with neoliberalism, because it shifts to there. And quite a lot of social democrats, like in Germany and Britain, and the American Democrats start to desert the cause of equality. So on traditionalism versus liberalism, liberalism wins. Inequality versus equality, inequality wins. Victory of neoliberalism. Now, what's happening now is, in a way, that old first axis of liberalism versus something else has woken up. Because the traditionalism has reinvented itself as nationalism. And so that old first axis is reinterpreting the politics that we'd become used to. And at the moment, we've got the two axes. The financial crisis has left us with enormous issues around inequality and the welfare state, but we've now got this new axis. And people in different movements, different parties, are trying to find their place in a world where the relationship between these axes is changing. And it leads to an extremely confused picture, actually. Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Thanks for your talks. I have three very brief questions to Bela. The first one, looking at the graph, you referred to the year 2002 as foundation of the civic circles. 1 year later, Jobbik was established as a party. What's the role of Jobbik in the divergence after 2003? And what's the role of Jobbik in your story about the new hegemony in Hungary? Secondly, you avoided the term populism. You also avoided the term radical right. Some scholars would refer to Fidesz as radical right and Jobbik as extreme right. how well do these concepts travel to Hungary? And my third question, you quickly mentioned that when it comes to the involvement of the church in right-wing mobilization, there's more to it than only ideological affiliation. Could you elaborate on this? Thanks.
Helpful question. I didn't mention by name, but actually Hungary's far-right party, the Jobbik, started as part of the civic circle movement. So it was integrated into it. To the extent that the party's first leader, Gábor Vona, was a member of Orbán Viktor's personal civic circle, which was a circle for Alliance for the Nation, right? And then they parted. So by 2002-3 fall, Jobbik founded its own party, did no longer stay close to Fidesz and within the civic circles. The party leader, Jobbik leader, basically told that they learned a lot from the organizational and ideational knowledge and skills of the civic circle. Where was Jobbik, the far-right party, first strongest? Precisely in the areas and municipalities where the civic circles, as well as the right-wing parties, could not get. Namely, the small villages, very small towns, and the economically depressed areas of Hungary, mostly in the northeast of Hungary, with large Roma populations. This is where the innovation of the Jobbik came. Be present in these village milieus and the anti-Roma contexts. In contrast, in these 4,500 pages of the civic circles materials, I never ever read any anti-Roma statement, right? So that is the Jobbik's discovery. And this is what made them really, partly, of course, pursuing a different form of militancy. They founded their own paramilitary group, basically a Nazi group, a neo-Nazi group, marching up and down on villages. There were Roma killings, actually, in these areas. So this is about the Fidesz and Jobbik and how their ways partly were together and partly parted. Not all the far-right movements left the civic circles with the Jobbik. Some of them stayed within and can be seen mostly in what I characterize as, basically radical nationalist groups pursuing either the sacral medievalist story, the military games and so on and so forth, or the ethnic Hungarian nationalism. Populism and radical, I did not use the term radical right. Well, I actually could. So I don't see this movement itself as a radical movement. I see itself as an umbrella movement for a number of more or less radical versus conservative organizations and ideational streams. So for the initial period, I find the differentiation between Fidesz, more associated with the civic circle movement as such, and Jobbik as more associated with the far right proper. Now, in the last years, it's very difficult. Roles change. Jobbik moved to the center. Fidesz moved to the far right with the refugee crisis and its response to the refugee crisis. Now again, I hear from the elected leader of my country that now he wants to build no longer illiberal state and illiberal democracy, but European Christian democracy. Let's see. By the way, relationship to European Christian democracy. Orbán himself thought that he models Fidesz and the civic circles after the German CDU-CSU. So he wanted a European party, big European mass party with a strong embeddedness in society. Actually, leaders of German Christian democracy and Christian socialism, came very frequently to civic circles events and decorate Orbán, tell Hungarians about the EU and so on and so forth. Orbán got basically all kinds of decorations and awards from big European figures of the right that one can at all get, right? So that cordial relationship did not started already that time. Last thing, church. So the strong presence of the churches. One explanation that I find, apart from the ideological affiliation, is that the churches got back their property, or much of their property, under the previous Orbán government. So the Catholic Church, for instance, 300 gymnasiums and many other educational establishments, healthcare, elderly homes, and so on. So, one explanation is it was payback time. Another explanation is that the church was afraid, and here I talk mostly about the Roman Catholic Church, but partly also the Lutheran and Calvinist. They were afraid that unlike under the right-wing government, they can act less as state churches, basically getting privileges from the state, and they tried to build up their own civic organizations and movements on the ground to put pressure on the power holders through that. So for the churches, being present in society became important at the same time as for other streams within the right. So this would be my explanation. This again, this is at the level of a hypothesis at the moment.
We are getting over time, and we think that it's worth continuing. So who feels like that you don't want to stay, feel free to leave. But of course, it's going to be even more interesting. So we will do 2 questions here, Andre and Olivia, and then we had a question over there, and then you will be 4th. Yeah.
I'll try to keep it short. It's to Béla, and it concerns the specificity of the Hungarian case. I would like to ask about how specific it is, because what bothers me really is that, and I don't have any doubts about the analysis of this particular case of Hungary, but what bothers me a little bit is that it basically gives support to this radical right narrative itself, because they say that now they are able to represent, the true movements and people who mobilize, those who are those losers of globalizations and globalization. This is what you mentioned, and it's an official narrative that liberals were unable to mobilize those people, and those who are now left behind are being picked up by these political forces, and this Hungarian case seems to support that, right? Because these 2 political parties are indeed embedded socially. They are embedded in civil society in Hungary. I have heard that from you several times, and I know this research. But how specific it is? Because you can see, this electoral support of radical right increasing in many countries. And even if you look inside this East European region, you can find cases where you have this electoral support of populist, whatnot, you call it, increasing, but at the same time, you don't find this, what you can find in Hungary. I mean, this, social movement basis of populist right and anything like this. Like, if I look at the country I come from, it's purely political marketing. So there is nothing like this, which we can see here in this picture. There is no civic circles. There is no, there are no protest events, and still this new parties which are using, or basically they are drawing on the same type of narrative, they are thriving in the elections. So is it that there are different ways to the mobilization of radical right, and we just should keep it in mind and not to stick to this type of narrative only?
Okay, so two questions, both of them relevant. So the one, it supports the government narrative. I am very sorry about that. But my position here is that of a researcher. So I remember always fondly Rainer Werner Fassbinder, famous German film director, who was told, okay, so on which side you are now, left or right? And he told, I am behind the camera. And this is how I see these things. Sorry, yes, if this supports the government, I sort of understand, what they talk about. The second, how specific it is to Hungary. My blunt answer is we don't know, because there is no well-founded empirical research, for instance, about the civil society base of the Polish right. I was begging to Polish colleagues, please, take a look at what happened. Is it just electoral politics that brought peace to power with this ideology? And then I always get news about the Radio Maria circles and Radio Gazeta Polska circles, and so on. You can go to the internet, study them, but somehow nobody does. And much of the research is basically stopping at the level of anthropological evidence, which I find extremely important, but there could be something big. So, if this is an inspiration to do something about the Czech Republic or Slovakia or, whichever country, then that's the mission accomplished. Now, of course, how specific it is. What is specific in Hungary, among other things, is real resilience, So 4 terms in power, 4 full terms out of these 3 consecutive terms, more and more drift towards electoral authoritarianism, what the country, in my view, is now. Let's wait. Maybe if peace will be re-elected in Poland, people will begin to think about, okay, why? These people do so stupid things, and then this will be an inspiration. So, how specific it is remains to be seen. That's how I see, for instance, social movement research agenda related to the region, but maybe also, Europe. Maybe social movement research too much focused on the nice movements, progressive movements. And nowadays it's also not so clear what is progressive, what not, And there is a lot of other things out there. I had no idea about this Hungary. This is not my Hungary. I have no connection to those people apart from my mother, as I mentioned. Yeah. So it's. I tried to convince students at the university to do social research on this, and it's not enough exotic for them. So they want to write about Occupy and Arab Spring and the Gezi movement and Gezi Park movement. And I told them, look at your country. It's fascinating. Anyway. Yeah. Was not very professional, but probably an answer.
Olivier, you don't want, or? Can you get a microphone so that also people who watch on YouTube know?
Like concept of populism. We all know that populism means a lot of things. We all know that populism has been used in America in the past, in Latin America during the first revolutions. The French Revolution is using it, so populism means a lot of things. Why, and I'm very grateful for that, why do we continue to use that concept? Especially today when, as you know, in France and perhaps other countries, some movements, I don't have an opinion about it, but some movements from the left are trying to build something which we can call a left populism, which is based on, not on diversity, but like coming back to the nation, blah, 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 blah. So when we use the term populism, when we oppose like losers and winners, as simply as that, what are we doing? We're just giving weapons to liberal governments. I mean, you can be at ease with it or not, but we contribute to a discourse, an ideology that equates what is populism of the left and what is populism of the right. And this is a terrible thing, and we're all responsible for it. So I'm just wondering why. And I had another question about church and the infrastructure it's offering to the movement, because we in social movement studies, we always mobilize the example of the church in the civil rights movement, blah, blah. So I think in your research it would be nice to have more input, more knowledge about what is exactly going on, not only in terms of money, but like networks, blah, blah. And I had a very important question. Can you explain us the meaning of the slice of bread cut in two parts?
Yes.
Because this is really something I would like to know, but perhaps after, since we don't have much time.
Some people make comments that they say are questions. You made a question that you said was a comment, because you did actually ask a question. It's a very, very, very good question. I try to avoid the term populism because it is a term of abuse usually. And to me, there's some things about what is populism. First, it consists of movements that invade the existing established structures. Right? It's like if there are some people sitting in an elegant room having polite conversation, and in comes some rough guy and shouts. Right? And that's how populists see themselves, and that's how they are seen. But part of that is that they don't have really they claim not to have their own political agenda. They will say, we do what the people want. But they usually don't have ways of asking the people. So for me, xenophobic movements are not populist, actually, because they have an agenda. They hate foreigners, they hate immigrants, they hate European Union, they hate United Nations. That's not populism, that's just a movement with a particular agenda that is trying to find space in. Occasionally you get examples of pure populist movements. I mean, Huey Long in the United States in the 1930s was a pure populist of that kind. He probably, if you analyze his positions, I think you'd end up calling him a social democrat, actually, with dictatorial tendencies, but then so do a lot of social democrats. Another case that looked fairly pure, and it's an interesting case to study, Movimento 5 Stelle, which seemed at first, I mean, they actually have their policies crowdsourced, right? So they say they've got no agenda. It's what the people want. But we see at the moment, we see this week, they're actually being pushed more and more towards a right-wing xenophobic position. And it would be very interesting to see what happens to their support base as a result of that. But to me, a real xenophobic movement it is not actually, strictly speaking, populist, because it knows what it wants. The other problem with populism, and this goes back to Jan Werner Müller's analysis, is that it says we don't have an agenda, we don't believe in institutions, we are the rough guys who invade the polite conversation in the room, and we therefore don't need any institutions. They don't really want an active part. And this is where I think that Orban's movement probably doesn't count as populist, because a real populist movement doesn't actually want an infrastructure. And in the end, all it has is a leader. And that's why, so now you get other movements that look populist, but which go in other directions. Like Unidas, what's it called? Unidas Podemos. United We Can, in Spain, started off saying, we're not of the left, we're not of the right. See, oh, this looks populist. But it shifted to the left, right? Syriza in Greece is similar. So it's almost impossible to sustain a pure populist movement, because eventually it finds it has to have an ideology. And certainly I don't think the xenophobic movements are necessarily populist at all.
I can very briefly explain the meaning, if you are interested, of this poster, the bread. So as you see, this is either a half loaf or a half slice, or a slice of bread, which itself is halved. Now, what is less clear for non-Hungarians or those who don't study Hungary is that actually the form of this slice equals the borders of earlier Greater Hungary, right? So current Hungary is much smaller. You see the small green thing, right? And the word means yes. Now here comes the interpretation. In 2004, December, Hungary had a referendum whether or not to offer a double passport, a Hungarian passport, to ethnic Hungarians living in the neighboring countries and actually in the further diasporas. 2004 was the entry of Hungary to the European Union. This was not yet there in the case of Romania, Serbia, the Ukraine, and so on. So what this then means, it is an appeal to Hungarians living in actual Hungary as a state, say yes to give the passport to your brethren living in the neighboring countries, by which you share everything what you have. You share your bread, right? So that's the story, roughly. And this was a campaign material that was produced by one of the best visual artists in Hungary and was circulated across all the civic circles for whom this was a major political event. They were mobilizing very strongly for attending the referendum and to say yes. There were all kinds of other spectacles related to the event, but this is the best symbol that I found too.
But that would mean that some Ukrainians would have had a European passport.
Yeah, yes, exactly, exactly. This is what it had to mean. Hungarians share everything with other Hungarians in different countries. They share their last piece of bread. What they really would have shared, right? This was a not valid referendum, right? The right lost this. What they really would have shared was the European passport. Under the Orban regime, this became policy. And actually, people outside Hungary can vote now. With Hungarian passport, can vote now in the Hungarian elections, even if they don't live permanently there. So it was also a smart move to extend the electoral base.
Very smart. Yeah.
Okay. I had I had one short question each. The first was about this. You brought up feminism as a possible response to this. And for me, it seems like feminism is at the moment also being challenged by populist movements a lot. Because on the one hand, like a lot of populist movements have female leaders now. There's also a lot of organizing going on like women protecting themselves against migrants. And actually a lot of feminist movements have been challenged by populists concretely on this. Why don't you solidarize yourself with the women who are attacked or things like this? So how do you think feminism can overcome this? Because that seems to be a precondition for feminism to provide any answer to this. Or don't you see that as a problem? And then the other question was, I think you have a very good explanation for why the right did this and why the left did not do this for when it started. But I'm wondering why in the last years has the left not caught up beyond being a few years back? Because first it was a very post-communist left, but actually, I mean, by now there has been some fragmentation on the left. There are a lot of forces there who are more inclined to this kind of social movement mobilizations. There have been attempts to do citizen dialogues on the ground, and I mean, even Jobbik seems to not be able to catch up, even though they've also tried to implement this. So what was it that made Fidesz so unique in the way they built this up, that neither the radical right nor the left has been able to catch up ever since?
Obviously, feminism is a very rich and extremely varied set of movements. It's part of its strength. I suppose my thinking really about this is, it's partly that I see feminism as an anti-machismo movement, almost by definition it is, which challenges certain aspects of xenophobic movements. But I'm also thinking in a way, something that's outside the agenda, I suppose, of a social movement debate. And I'm thinking about expressions of the class structure of post-industrial society. One of the characteristics of post-industrial society is that a far bigger proportion of the workforce is female than was the case in industrial society. And in many ways, women in the workforce experience issues that are shared by men, but which women mainly face. And these are very major issues of work-life balance. And how on earth is it possible to get a decent life when you're working all day, you've got to bring up children. And so women, in a way, if you go back, see, I'm really talking about social democratic theory now rather than movement theory, so I'm really outside the wall of the conference. Original social democracy was very much a male movement. It was fighting for the rights of the breadwinner male, right, man, bringing not just the Hungarian bread, but all bread. But that didn't mean it was an anti-woman movement. It just saw the interests of women included in the interests of men. Right? And that's one reason why, in those days of industrial society, the majority of working class women never voted for social democratic parties, because they didn't. Only a minority voted for social democratic parties. They saw the church as speaking for them much more than trade unions. Now, if you've now got a workforce which is more balanced in gender terms, and where the junior positions, the lower positions in the hierarchies of post-industrial work organizations are mainly filled by women who experience these general issues, it seems to me the future of trade unions and of social democracy is in seeing the world through the eyes of women's problems in a way that also responds to some of men's problems. That's really what I'm seeing. Now, I can see, yes, obviously, women in Cologne might well decide to organize against Muslim men. But I just think there is if one's trying to see something I left out of my argument, I suppose, if one's saying how does a post-industrial class structure express itself politically, I think it has to be seen that the sort of what replaces the old working class challenge is very much a female perspective on the workforce. I can't get any further than that because I'm a man, right? There's a limit to how far I can take these arguments, but I can just see that, but I can't then fill in the detail.
Just briefly, so I see two reasons. That the left liberal government was nicer to the rising right than vice versa. So in many ways, you know, these movements also, there was a question about finance. Part of the finance came, of course, from European national sources of civil society building, right, during this period. Now we are in much tougher times. Even the foreign finance NGOs are attacked as national security risks. The second issue is that those opposition forces that actually try to build their own civil society try to avoid political involvement and ideological affiliations. For instance, there is a small party that tries to establish local circles of activity, right? Now, that is okay, so this local problem solving, but my idea would be they should not be afraid of being ideological, because people like to think that they do things, you know, they collect garbage, protect the environment because the Lord likes it, or the nation develops with this. So one should not look down on ideas. People like to do things that show them bigger than they are. And therefore, you know, I think this kind of non-ideological civic involvement in itself cannot be system transforming. This is what I think. Yeah.
Okay, and then we have the last question.
I have a brief question. my question is about the policing of this civic circus movement. To what extent, I mean, was there any police following, writing, secret intelligence writing reports on them, or did they face any police violence during the protests? To what extent they were seen a threat by not the left liberal government, but the capitalist state itself, because obviously capitalism survives without liberalism. And I just want to link this to a broader question of, is it, when we compare far left and far right movements, is it really or to what extent it is a framing success and mobilization success in the case of far right movements? What's the factor of repression by the state? So it seems like it doesn't come into the picture, and if it's a factor, then perhaps I mean it changes the whole picture on the kind of resources you have and on the kind of tactics that you can invest into. That's the question.
Yeah.
So then, sorry, I forgot that part. So maybe then it's not about effective appeal of the movement, but there is a larger factor there in the case of building a far-left movement. I mean, anti-capitalist movement, which the capitalist state obviously sees as a systemic threat.
Yeah. So I have some evidence in the material that they felt that the police uses infiltration, spying, and other repressive measures against them. How open or closed the civic circus should be. This was a standard debate within the movement. Some of them thought they should be open to people who they can convince or who, by their grievances, are ready to join their circles, even if they are left or left-wing people. Liberals not, so that was an anathema in many ways. Now, obviously, I cannot study police documents. This is just 50 years ago, and I would again better not do it. Maybe in my next life. With the far right, and this is two different issues, let me stress. So this is an encompassing movement, and then the far right actually founded its own party and movement. The attitude of first the left liberal state was that of shock, so that when they saw this immense, these columns of black-dressed guys marching up and down in villages and in the streets and so on, supported actually tacitly at least by the right, by the non-far right. They were shocked, and then they banned the movement, and the whole Roma killing story, where basically during several years, 7 or 8 Roma people, including children, were killed and injured. We are still before the end of the trial. This happened pretty much early in this period, during the left liberal government. It is entirely unclear so far what part the the intelligence community, right? I love this term. The intelligence community in Hungary played in the whole thing. So, yes, this is part of the story, but at the moment, it's very difficult to see how big part.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your questions, and to presenters. Don't forget about the group picture, please. Should we do it now, or?
Very brief, 2-3 brief things. We have decided to do the picture tomorrow after the keynote on 68 mobilization, so that more people will be here. There is also a change in terms of rooms. panel 8 tomorrow morning between 11:31 will be here in Altana and not in Filippo Strozzi, so that more people can gather here. And